Hi, everybody. My name is Alan Oliver. I'm the president of the Thornburg Foundation. We're so glad that everybody is joining us today for this exciting conversation around looking at housing and homelessness, and in particular looking with the help of Alex Horowitz from Pew at some co-living housing solutions, as well as kind of overall looking at housing shortage in the US and New Mexico. Just a little bit of background before we jump in. So again, I'm with the Thornburg Foundation. For those folks who don't know us, we're a family foundation based here in Santa Fe. Our vision is to advance systemic change that serves the public good. We've been funding in homelessness for about 20 years, and then funding into homelessness and housing for about 2.5 years. In September of last year, we worked on a grant with the Pew Charitable Trust, and that they have been, of course, leading. And it was looking at how to address the complex roots of national housing shortage. It was also how to identify vacant commercial space that are, say, primarily office buildings, and look at, are there ways to convert that into more low-cost housing and co-living micro units? And through that grant, which, you know, their work is national work, and they've been working in a number of different cities looking at this model. But through our grant, we were able to add Santa Fe and Albuquerque to that national study, which we're really excited about. And so the results of that study are now out, and Alex Horowitz, who's the project director for housing policy at the Pew Charitable Trust, is here to kind of walk us through their research, kind of looking overall at housing and kind of housing policy, but then also looking in deeper at the actual solutions that they've generated around co-living. And so just as a kind of lay of the land, what we're going to do is we're going to hand over to Alex here in a moment. He has about a 35-minute presentation to go through. We're going to have about 15 minutes of questions, both from me and from this group. And so as we go through, please put your questions into the chat, and we will get to them at the end of Alex's presentation. And then we're anticipating closing out around noon. And that's kind of our program for today. And with that, I'd like to actually hand it over to Alex. So,
all right, thanks, Alan, and thanks to the Thornburg Foundation for sponsoring this work and hosting today's webinar. Great to be with you. And hi, Leslie. Hi, Russell. So excited to talk to you all about the work we're doing and work on the housing shortage. The Pew Charitable Trust is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We do work in the public interest. I live in DC. And we are interested in how we would get out of this mess that we're in with an enormous housing shortage in the US that has driven up rents, that has driven up prices, that has driven up displacement, that has driven up homelessness. And so I want to go over some of that material with you today and do questions at the end also. So feel free to go ahead and ask, but this is, you know, its course is about New Mexico, but we're seeing a lot of the same trends in New Mexico that we're seeing in the rest of the country. So rents are near an all-time high in the US, and half of renters are spending more than 30% of income on rent, and New Mexico is right in line with the rest of the country in terms of share of rent-burdened households. 27% of US renters spending more than 50% of income on rent. Same in New Mexico. 50%, that's a tough number. Once households are spending more than 50% of income on rent, because that puts them at risk for not being able to pay other bills. At that point, eviction risk goes up, homelessness risk goes up, displacement risk goes up. Thinking about other adverse outcomes, people getting their electricity shut off, people who struggle with transportation costs, as transportation costs have become the #2 line item in household budgets behind housing costs. Part of what's going on is that household size keeps going down. And when household size keeps going down, that means we need more homes to house the same number of people because we live in smaller households than we used to. US household size at an all-time low, 2.5 people. New Mexico actually has a lower than average household size relative to the US at 2.44 people. 63% of households in the US have 1 or 2 people. New Mexico at 67%. So our housing stock is not a great match for how we're living today. Only about 1/4 of our housing stock is multifamily. meaning duplexes, threeplexes, fourplexes, apartment buildings. But 67% of New Mexico households have one or two people in them. So our housing stock is a mismatch for our population. Underlying all of this is the housing shortage, estimated at 4 to 7 million homes. Now, we don't know definitively that it's in the 4 to 7 million home range. It could fall outside that range. We know we have a big housing shortage. But if it's not in that range, it's not under 4 million. It's over 7 million. It's gotten that severe. And candidly, for Western states, California's failure to build housing is resonating everywhere because the most populous state in the country has not been adding nearly enough homes. And that is resulting in outmigration from California, primarily into other Western states that then experience their own housing shortage in turn. So why are rents at near an all-time high, with the median rent in the US surpassing $1,400 a month for the first time, and with half of renters spending more than 30% of income on rent? What's going on? Big picture, I think most people know if they've ever bought or sold a home, and there are a lot of homes out there, that's a buyer's market. There's inventory. Homes go below asking. Homes sit on the market a little while. What about when there aren't many homes out there? Well, it's a seller's market. And rents work just the same way. So we're in a landlord's market, and we have been in a landlord's market for years now because there aren't enough rentals available. And when there aren't enough rentals available, that scarcity leads to rents getting bid up. That's why rents are so high. When there's a lot of rental housing stock available, rents go down. That's not what's happening in New Mexico. So whether we're talking about homes to buy or homes to rent, there just aren't enough in New Mexico. Inventory is way down in New Mexico from where it was at the peak for homes to buy. Median home cost at the end of 2018 in New Mexico was $186,000. By the end of last year, it was $302,000. Now, I will say there are a lot of parts of the US where we've seen modest price declines this year. That's because inventory has been creeping up in some parts of the US. Some places have made it easier to build. New Mexico is not one of those. Prices have continued to rise in New Mexico this year. And since the data came out that we published in our New Mexico publication Alan referenced earlier this year, prices have gone up further in New Mexico, median of $302,000 at the end of last year, now at $312,000 in August. So that's not great news because there are parts of the country that are building a lot. Florida, Texas, where we've seen prices start to decline a bit and homeownership get a little closer for middle-class households, but that's just not the case in New Mexico, which has not been producing the amount of housing that we're seeing in states that are making it easier to build. So prices have risen yet again this year. Now, what we're most concerned about is rents, because renters have much lower household wealth on average than homeowners, and they're much more vulnerable to changes in the housing market because they don't have a mortgage that has locked in their monthly cost of housing. They don't own their home outright. They are subject to what is happening in the market, and there really isn't any way around that except for adding more homes. So when we looked at New Mexico's change in rent and saw a change of 58% during the 7-year time period, outpacing the US, with rents in New Mexico rising at double the rate of the US overall. Albuquerque right in line with the rest of the state. Santa Fe saw even steeper rent increases than Albuquerque or than the rest of the state. And as rents have softened in some parts of the country this year, which is good news, just a little, in line with prices, because prices and rents tend to move roughly in tandem. New Mexico, rents have risen again this year. So median rent in the state is about over $1,100 now, and it is higher in Albuquerque, and it is higher in Santa Fe, but the national trend where we're seeing rents and prices moderate in some places that are adding a lot of housing has not reached New Mexico, where housing production has stayed low. So the housing shortage is really not good for much of anyone, because even homeowners usually want to downsize at some point or trade up at some point, and that means they're spending more when they do. Even for homeowners, it means often their kids can't live near them because they can't afford something. The housing shortage is slowing economic growth. It is causing traffic as people live further out because they can't live close to places they go every day because of restrictive zoning. And that drives up transportation costs, leads to homelessness, leads to displacement. Doesn't affect everyone in the same way, though. I mentioned that renters, who are 35% of the population, are affected more than homeowners. Well, we hand-coded all of the zip codes in Zillow and looked at rent growth over the past 7 years. And it turns out the lowest income quarter of zip codes have seen the steepest rent increases. 62% jump in the bottom quarter of zip codes by income versus 44% in the top quarter. Look, 44% rent increase is serious, but a 62% rent increase for people who can afford the least is devastating. Why is this happening? When there's not enough housing, the market works like an escalator that's moving down. And that means people rent down because they can't afford something in the neighborhood where they would normally live. High-income people end up moving into middle-income neighborhoods to find something they can afford. Middle-income people ending up moving into low-income neighborhoods to find something they can afford. And everyone piles up at the bottom of that escalator. Low-income households have nowhere to go, end up displaced, end up homeless. Most commonly, they end up absorbing steep rent increases they really can't afford. And we see that crowding is the most severe in areas that are adding the least housing. So how do we get out of this? Well, there are places that have done things differently. If we were having this conversation a decade ago, I would have said to you, look, every real estate analyst out there, every economist out there, every quantitative researcher out there says this is supply and demand. And if we add more homes, if we add more supply, that will improve affordability because we won't have that scarcity. But I would have said, but we don't really have the data because it's not available. Not enough jurisdictions have done this. Look, now we've got good data coming out every month from real estate aggregators. And we've got jurisdictions that have tried something new. We look at Minneapolis, Minnesota, New Rochelle, New York, Portland, Oregon, Tysons, Virginia, and there are others as well. In all of them, once they made it easier to build, they updated their zoning, they made it easy to build apartments, all of them started producing housing at least double the rate of the US overall. And all of them saw rent growth sharply slow to less than 1% a year. Even while during this time period, rents went up 30% in the US over the 6-year time period, all of these jurisdictions saw rent growth between 0 and 5%. None of them did it through rent control. All of them did it by making it easier to build, especially apartments, which are the most undersupplied housing type. And all of these jurisdictions grew during this time period. Normally, growth is something that strains affordability because more people are moving in. All of these places grew, but they all improved affordability because incomes continued to rise, but rent growth stopped or slowed during this time period. So affordability got better. Well, okay, what about New Mexico? So during this time period, Houston had made it quite easy to build. They had enacted some local reforms to allow especially more townhouses. Minneapolis enacted reforms to allow more apartments. They eliminated their parking minimums. They produced a lot more housing than either New Mexico as a whole or Albuquerque. And while rents were going up 60% in New Mexico, they only went up 13% in Houston, slower than income growth. And they actually dropped 2% during this time period in Minneapolis. Once more housing came online, that took the pressure off the existing housing stock. The reason more housing came online is because they made it easy to build. Houston, especially through minimum lot size reforms to allow townhouses, they got 80,000 of them in the city. Minneapolis, primarily through eliminating their parking minimums and making apartments a by right use on commercial corridors. Now, that's good news, right? We know that's good news. That's improving affordability overall. But what about the people who we're most concerned about? What about the people who have the least and are at the greatest vulnerability for homelessness, for displacement, for not being able to cover their other bills? Well, here are 6 jurisdictions that added a lot of housing in 2023 because A, they welcomed it, but B, interest rates had been low, so a lot of apartments came online at the same time. Rents went down year over year in all 6 of these markets. That's what we would expect, but indeed it happened. Well, rents for older, naturally affordable apartments, known as Class C, actually dropped more than rents for Class A. Look, the new stuff was fancy, no doubt about it, right? We got a lot of buildings that had amenities, had a gym, maybe they had a roof deck. That's Class A apartments. But once those came online, remember we talked about the escalator moving down where people pile up at the bottom. The escalator could start moving up again. And so middle-income households could move out of low-income neighborhoods. High-income households could move out of middle-income neighborhoods, take the pressure off the housing stock. And so even though the new housing was not Class C, kind of older, naturally affordable apartments, those are the rents that dropped the most because the pressure came off that housing stock and low-income households no longer needed to compete for their own homes with people who had more resources than they did. Displacement is a concern that comes up a lot, right? How do we reduce displacement? And sometimes there's a concern that if we allow new homes, we'll get more displacement. It turns out not allowing new homes is a bigger driver of displacement. These are the 4 largest cities in the US. Well, only one of them made it easy to build and added housing at a fast clip, and it was Houston. Houston added Black residents during the first 2 decades of the century. New York City, LA, Chicago all lost Black residents during this time period. How did Houston do it? They added homes. They made it easier to build. The racial wealth gap is causing displacement because people who have the fewest resources and the least wealth are least able to compete in a market when there aren't enough homes. But there is a solution, which is allow enough homes for everybody to avoid that artificial competition so that landlords are competing for tenants instead of tenants having to compete with higher resourced households for the same homes. Raleigh, North Carolina, another nice example. They enacted strong zoning reforms in 2021 and 2022 to allow more apartments and more townhouses. Well, their housing production shot up 60% once they enacted those reforms. Most of the new homes were apartments or townhouses that previously weren't easy to build, but they were allowed after that reform as a matter of right, meaning they didn't have to go through a subjective permitting process. Rent growth slowed and homelessness had been rising in Raleigh. And with the new housing that came online and the slowed rent growth, then homelessness started dropping in Raleigh. We've done mostly local examples so far today, but this discussion has moved to the state level. It's great when localities act, but to get widespread action to end the housing shortage, the real movement has come at the state level, and it probably needs to, because even if one jurisdiction acts and then the surrounding ones don't, the impact is noticeable, but it's not nearly as big. Regional housing supply drives local rents more than local housing supply because housing markets are interrelated across jurisdiction lines. From 2011 to 2016, all states combined in the US only passed an average of 1 law a year to allow more homes. 2017, 2022, 18 laws a year. 2023, 2024, an average of 48 laws a year. 2025, it's been a record-breaking year for laws to allow more homes. More than 80 of them have passed around the country. Probably the single most effective reform there is allowing apartments as a matter of right automatically on commercially zoned land. That's the state version of what Minneapolis did and New Rochelle, New York did, what Tysons, Virginia did. So Montana has passed 2 laws, one in 2023, and then they built on that this year. California has, Florida has, Hawaii, Colorado, Texas. All of these states have passed laws along these lines. And 13, I believe, states overall have passed a law like this. 18 states have passed a law to allow casitas on all or most single-family lots, including Arizona, which passed one in 2024 and then expanded it in 2025. Colorado did last year. Utah has. California has passed a number of them. So we're seeing these laws spread, and most states that have passed recent reforms have included some kind of casita law to allow smaller, less expensive homes on single family lots. We're seeing other policies too. Permitting, so third-party reviews and inspections, limiting environmental review and lawsuits, simplifying the process to build and shortening timelines, and also enacting building code reforms, because there are really 4 buckets of laws that push down the housing supply and make it hard to build. Restrictive zoning, restrictive permitting, restrictive building codes, and restrictive financing, limited access to credit. All 4 of these matter, and we're seeing states tackle these in a multifaceted way. But building code reforms are a piece of the puzzle because it's gotten very expensive to build apartments in the US, more so than in other high-income countries. Manufactured housing is also one way to deal with this, because manufactured housing is the one area of housing that has really kept construction costs down. And it's by using an assembly line and having a federal building code, the code established by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And especially for starter homes, you can see that dramatic price difference on the left, where a small site-built home that would be about $162,000. These are in 2020 dollars, I should say. And then you've got a manufactured home for similar size and quality, it'd be $57,000. So the savings are enormous to adding manufactured housing relative to site built, and we are seeing states pass laws to allow more use of manufactured homes. Spend most of the rest of the time talking about homelessness and office to co-living. So New Mexico just didn't add as much housing as the US overall, and the US didn't add enough during these years either. But as a result of not adding much housing, rents, as mentioned in New Mexico, rose at about double the rate of the US. And unsurprisingly, homelessness rose at double the rate of the US, because homelessness and rents move in tandem. If we look at markets around the country, high-cost cities have high homelessness rates. Low-cost cities have low homelessness rates. There aren't that many exceptions. When New Mexico had a relatively low level of homelessness, it's because it was a much less expensive state than it is today. But as rents have gone up, homelessness has also. But this is a very strong relationship between rents and homelessness. It persists whether we're looking at the state level, the county level, or the city level. And it's not just that expensive places have a lot of homelessness and inexpensive places have low levels of homelessness. When rents change, homelessness moves in tandem. So if we look at the places where homelessness rose a lot in recent years, it's because rents rose a lot in those places. If we look at places where homelessness dropped, those were all places that held rent growth slower than income growth. So relative affordability improved. Minneapolis is a nice example, because once Minneapolis allowed by right apartments on commercial corridors and eliminated their parking minimums, they were producing housing at triple the rate of the rest of Minnesota. That stopped their rents from going up. And at the same time that that homelessness was rising and rents were rising in the rest of Minnesota, rent growth stayed flat and homelessness dropped in the city of Minneapolis. This works pretty fast. In 2017, you had to earn 80% of the area median income in Minneapolis to afford the median rent. By 2023, you only get to earn 66% of the area median income to afford the median rent. It's a pretty rapid change. In inflation-adjusted terms, rents are down 25% there since the start of 2017. That is a big improvement in affordability. A lot of top 50 cities have been losing Black residents during this time period. As I showed you with New York, with LA, with Chicago, Minneapolis, like Houston, has been adding Black residents during this time period because they're adding homes. So they're avoiding that artificial scarcity that's created by not having enough housing. I showed you Raleigh before, but I wanted to flag here that there are multiple ways to do this. Raleigh, like Houston, has made it easy to build townhouses, and townhouses are fee simple, right? Meaning that these are for sale homes usually. And that can mean that home ownership comes within reach too. We've mostly talked about rents today, but home ownership can come within reach too. The two sort of secret elements to make home ownership come within reach are, one, allowing manufactured housing, but two, allowing homes on smaller lots. And Raleigh is a place that didn't just use one tactic to expand housing supply. Most places have done it with apartments on commercial corridors. Raleigh did some of that, especially around transit, but they also made it easy to build townhouses during this time period. And both of those can help with reducing homelessness. So why did we have roughly no homelessness in the US from the late 1940s to the late 1970s? And why was homelessness so much lower in the past in the US than it is today? Well, we had single room occupancies, SROs. These were often dark, these were often small, these were often dingy, but they were a lot of the housing stock. In major cities, these were 1/10 of the rental housing stock in the mid-1900s. These are all $20-$25 I'm showing you. So today, somebody who's at the federal poverty line for a one-person household, they can afford, using 30% of income, they can afford $391 a month. The median rent for a one-bedroom in the US is $1,205. Not even close. Look at SRO rents from a century ago, $230 a month in today's dollars. Now, how can we use this history to kind of help us? Well, the way that homelessness took off, which really happened in the late 1970s, early 1980s, where we went from very little to a lot, is the number of unsubsidized rentals that had low rents, defined here as under $785 a month. It's based on data availability. The number of unsubsidized rentals that were inexpensive tanked in the US during this time period, fell by almost 1/3. But the number of renter households that didn't have housing subsidies and had incomes under 40% of the area median, where they're going to struggle, went up. So the available housing stock is declining while the need for it is going up. This is where homelessness came from, and how we went from having very little to a lot in a short period of time, mostly because of the decline of single room occupancies, but also inexpensive rentals generally, a lot of which were pushed out by increasingly restrictive zoning codes and building codes and difficult permitting. So how do we get it back, but make it nice? Office to residential conversions overall aren't working that well, but office to co-living is much more promising. So instead of a studio apartment of, say, 440 square feet, here's an example of a single, a little bigger, a little nicer than my college dorm room, which I shared with someone else, and it's 155 feet. Okay, how does this help us with office to co-living? So here's a rendering from the architecture firm Gensler, who we worked with for this project. And look, it's small. You'll notice it doesn't have a kitchen in it. It doesn't have a bathroom in it. Those are in the hallway, but This is a place to live that would be located near jobs, near transit, near commerce, would be safe and clean, but small. And you can see that the kitchens are out in the common shared area. So are individual shared bathrooms. So are individual shower rooms. And there's laundry on floor. So this is a building that would be converted from vacant office space into dorm style housing. With dorm style housing, all the units are around the perimeter. Everyone's got a big window, but you can fit triple the number of units that you could with regular apartments by using this model. And an office building that could not be converted to regular apartments can be converted into dorm style housing, because layouts that don't work for regular apartments, involving a deep floor plate where the windows are far from the center of the floor, actually work really well for office to co-living conversions. And with this building that's 5 stories, so one would be kind of lobby, retail, ground floor, and then 4 residential, you could get 256 homes here that are well located, but inexpensive. Here's the Santa Fe version. Santa Fe doesn't have a lot of vacant office space, but this can work as new build as well, especially on a commercial corridor, like near a shopping center. So this is an example of what it would look like in Santa Fe, where this would be 60 units, 24 per floor. On the upper 2 floors, 12, using half the ground floor. And then you've got shared kitchen space. And then you've got shared individual bathrooms in the middle on each level. So this can work as either an office conversion or as new builds. But how do we get that low-cost housing that used to be prevalent in the US, but make it nice and safe and clean and code compliant? Here's a way. So a new build studio in Albuquerque or Santa Fe, especially if it's income restricted, you're looking at 300,000 plus a unit in total development costs. That includes land, construction, permitting, architecture fees, engineering. So these units, which would come furnished, clock in at a much, much lower price point. 130,000 and change in Albuquerque for the office conversion, 184,000 in Santa Fe for the new builds. But some of that money would come from the private sector. So that means subsidies could go even further. In Santa Fe, where the median rent's about $1,500 a month, we project a unit like this would go for about $800 a month and would include utilities. So affordable to somebody earning under half the area median. Albuquerque would be looking at about $700 a month in rent for something like this. So to produce homes affordable at 45% of the area median income with $10 million in subsidies in Albuquerque, we'd be looking at 43 apartments if they were studios, or 154 if they were co-living. This is not going to work purely unsubsidized, but it's something that could stretch subsidy dollars a whole lot further and get more housing for the same money, especially because 40% of renter households have 1 person in them. So this is an undersupplied housing type. And it's worked with doubles too. 68% of renter households have 1 or 2 people in them. So this meets that demand, even though it doesn't work for big families. We're seeing states pass laws to facilitate housing like this as we wrap up. Texas passed a strong office to residential law in 2025. Hawaii did so last year. Washington passed a bill last year to make micro units a by right use anywhere that multifamily housing is allowed. And overall, the public likes it. The public is into allowing more housing. Look, not everybody loves more housing. I'm going to acknowledge that. There have been several academic studies that look at people who show up at community meetings. They do not like housing as much as everybody else. People who come to community meetings where we gather input through a 6 or 8 hour process are very, very different than the community overall. They are demographically unlike the community. They are much more likely to be homeowners. They are less likely to be hourly employees. They are unlikely to have young kids at home. The process we use to gather information matters. When I was interviewing former mayor of New Rochelle, New York, Noam Bramson, who oversaw one of the largest upzonings in the US, he said, look, if you looked at public hearings, if you looked at the comments on social media posts, you would think nobody likes housing and that the public is against it. But they did proactive outreach and they got positive feedback. He ran for re-election after one of the biggest upzonings in the US and won easily, and then ran again and won easily. When we want to know how people feel about something, we usually don't hold a 6-hour community meeting and see who shows up, because the people who show up are very, very different from the community overall. We do proactive outreach, we do surveys, and we figure out what people's goals are and then how we can achieve them. Whether we're talking to Republicans, independents, or Democrats, our nationally representative survey of 5,000 people found that the public is consistently supportive of most reforms to allow more homes. Generally speaking, reforms that are about downtowns and corridors are the most popular. And we start to see narrower majorities when we're talking about single family blocks that already exist. But across party lines, we see a lot of support for dealing with the housing shortage, improving affordability, bringing homeownership within reach, and the kind of allergic reaction to allowing more homes that sometimes shows up at community meetings doesn't show up at all when we look at representative data that includes the whole community. My email is here and more info is here, but we have time for a Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And so, well, we got a couple of, we got 4 really good questions, and I'm going to actually jump right to those because you've actually answered all the questions that I had. So we're going to start with, and Jen's actually got a couple, so we'll start with Jen's. But so with regard to expediting permit reviews, can you share more details about how those bills were structured?
Sure. So for permit reviews, there are really 3 policies that have led to simpler, faster permitting. One is actually land use. It's making more housing types by right. Once more housing types are by right, permitting becomes much simpler and much faster, because there's a clear set of rules about what's allowed and builders can follow it. When Minneapolis made apartments on corridors by right, the request for variances dropped 70% the first year. So making more housing types by right simplifies permitting a lot. A reform that we're seeing more of is third-party review, allowing licensed third parties, usually engineers, to conduct inspections that are part of the permitting process. That is very, very important for modular housing. Modular housing really doesn't work without third-party reviews because they use an assembly line and they need to get the homes off the assembly line. So they need an inspector there right away. If the electrical is in, they're going to seal it in with drywall. You have to have the electrical inspector there to review it before you can seal it in. So it's very important for modular housing, but it also is a big deal for site-built housing. And so Georgia, I believe, was the first state to allow third-party review. And we're seeing it spread to other states now, where licensed third parties can conduct inspections during the permitting process. The other piece after by right, making more housing types by right and third-party review is pre-approved plans. Arizona passed a bill this session on pre-approved plans, and so did Maine, and so did Oregon. And all of them require that a menu of pre-approved plans be available, because that speeds up the permitting process and it reduces pre-development costs for builders, because they know what's allowed and they can use those plans instead of needing a third party to draw every home essentially on a custom basis. And so then the city department is really just reviewing the site to make sure that the proposed type of home is compatible with the site. And we're seeing jurisdictions do pre-approved plans for casitas, for single family, for townhouses, for duplexes, really up to 8-unit buildings. And we know of jurisdictions that are interested in launching pre-approved plans up for 12-unit buildings as well. But so far, we're mostly seeing casitas and single family up to 6-unit, and a couple of jurisdictions are offering 8-unit pre-approved land buildings. But those are the three: by right, third-party review, pre-approved plans.
Great. We're going to keep going. Jen has a couple more questions that are really good, so we're going to keep going with those. And so the second one, so where they are doing these office building conversions, are they also providing new financing to help incentivize developers to do these conversions? If so, do you have any details on those financial products? This also might be an opportunity to mention what Sarita is doing with Department of Workforce Solutions.
Yeah, so these are going to require some kind of subsidy to work, and LIHTC is not a great option because tax credit investors usually don't like new things and like to have comps before, right? So the syndication process is going to be tricky for LIHTC. But home or community development block grants or affordable housing trust funds or housing production trust funds could be a good fit. We are seeing some states set up revolving loan funds, usually in conjunction with the Center for Public Enterprise, which is a smart solution because that is countercyclical. So it means that there's still financing available when interest rates are high or when there are downturns. And that could be a good source of funding for projects like this. We haven't actually seen office to co-living conversions yet. This is an idea. We're seeing a couple of office to dorm conversions, literal college dorms. So those structurally, those are really the same thing, but they're being done with the university. The operations are going to be a little different, but we're envisioning 24-hour security, cleaning of common areas, third-party cleaning of common areas, and key card access only to residents' own floor, which should make building operations work much better. But overall, OpEx is going to be high for these. Gensler's thinking 38 to 45% on OpEx, which is going to be at the top end of multifamily.
Great, super helpful. Last question from Jen, at least so far. Is could we talk about like what are the best populations for this type of co-living? And I would welcome like what are, I understand certain cities have been already using it, and particularly Europe, I understand that this is a little bit more already in use, I guess.
Yeah, so in Europe and in some Asian countries, this kind of housing is pretty common, especially for people in their 20s. And the use cases, though, I think are go way beyond that. There's interest in maybe having senior floors of buildings for people who are on fixed incomes. I think that the idea of master leasing a floor makes a lot of sense also. So imagine a school district. School districts, especially in expensive areas, are having trouble with hiring, especially early career teachers and hourly employees, because it's too hard to live near the schools where they're working because housing is too expensive. Master leasing a floor for a school district could make all the sense in the world. There's an issue right now with flight attendant homelessness because, flight attendant jobs don't pay all that well. And some cities that are hubs have gotten expensive. So having a master leased floor for an airline or an airport could make a lot of sense. Having a master leased floor for a hospital or a healthcare system, especially with traveling medical employees, could make a lot of sense too. And that way you've sort of got a built-in sense of community, and it could make the financing easier to have floors that are pre-leased to a master tenant. And then that employer is offering an employee benefit of relatively low-cost housing in easy commuting distance of jobs.
Great. Okay, we're going to shift over to Paul's question, which is, do you have examples of manufactured housing with rental units? And are there manufactured housing examples with duplex, fourplex, et cetera?
Yeah, so manufactured housing is absolutely used as a rental, not just a homeownership option. And the fact that the production costs for manufactured housing are low mean that it makes a lot of sense as rental housing also. The multifamily manufactured housing space is still small, but there are models. So and those are relatively new, just in the last couple of years, where we're seeing more duplexes from manufactured home builders and some 3 and 4 unit homes. There are still some building code impediments to doing multi-story manufactured housing. But in terms of duplexes, we are seeing those. But one of the nice things about manufactured housing is that it works really well for homeownership. So the cost to own is pretty low. If you have a manufactured home that is on a small lot, because large lot sizes make manufactured housing not make sense because the land costs get too high. But the new ones can actually reduce utility bills also, because the latest models are net zero ready. And that means if you add solar to manufactured home, then you have no utility bill for right, for your electric, because they're energy efficient, the homes are smaller, and if they're on a small lot, that can work well as rental housing, but it also can be very cost effective way to be a homeowner.
Fantastic. Great. And I know, and Ari, thanks for your question about the QR code. What we're going to actually do is maybe take a screenshot of that and send it around as an email after the program, so everybody has access to it. Erica has a question about, will the micro units qualify for HUD subsidy, Section 8, PSH vouchers, any other kind of credits, I guess?
Yeah, so we asked Gensler to design the co-living buildings to be voucher eligible, and they did. So that means all the units have to be at least 110 square feet, which they are. The ratios of occupants per toilet can't be more than 6:1, and they're not. Occupants per sink can't be more than 6:1, and they're not. Occupants to shower can't be more than 6:1, and they're not. So everything is designed to be compliant with HUD's SRO voucher, which has a small area fair market rent that's 3/4 of an efficiency. And the projected rents for these buildings in all the cities that we've looked at so far fall under the HUD's small area fair market rent for SROs. So that's 75% of the efficiency rent. So they are all voucher eligible for one-person households.
That's great. If I was better at doing the work with Zoom, I would send a link in here about what LIHTC is, but do you mind giving a quick definition for LIHTC for Ari?
Sure. So the low-income housing tax credit program, which I bet there are people on this call who know more about it than I do, but there is a federal low-income housing tax credit program. And so the federal government allocates money to create tax credits. The tax credits are distributed to state housing finance agencies who award them to builders for income restricted units. There are 9% credits that are more valuable, 4% credits that are less valuable. And then the tax credits themselves go through a syndication process where they're sold off to tax credit investors who use them to reduce companies' tax liability. LIHTC is the biggest program in the US to enable income restricted housing. And typically in recent years, 20 to 25% of multifamily housing units in the US are in buildings that have LIHTC somewhere in the capital stack. So very impactful program, but not the only one to build income restricted housing.
Thanks, Alex. Next question we have is from Monet Solo from Coalition for Ending Homelessness. And so what are the issues we're seeing in with the abuse of manufacturing homes communities, in that venture capital funds are coming in and buying them and then raising rent? And we're seeing that this cause more issues around individuals and home families falling into homelessness, and I would assume in New Mexico. So thoughts?
So a lot of manufactured homes are on land that is not owned by the people who live in the homes. So in the community, the home can either be a rental. And if it's a rental, I mean, people, like any tenant, have the option of moving somewhere else. But if residents own the home but rent the land, they're in a tough spot, because moving the home is very expensive, often infeasible. And then if the rent under the home goes up, then somebody essentially needs to pay that rent increase, but they don't have a lot of options because they own the home and it's a major asset for them. It's hard to move. So that is a difficult situation. Restrictive zoning is part of the problem here because not enough manufactured housing communities are getting built. And as housing gets more expensive, we've seen people move toward manufactured housing, including in communities, because it's something they can afford. But then once they're there, they're in a vulnerable position. The difficulty in getting a loan to buy a manufactured home is also part of the problem. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have not made it easy. They should be buying more manufactured home loans. And because they're not, that has meant the interest rates on these loans are high and the denial rates on these loans for these loans are high, even though manufactured homes are a great option and they cost less. The financing to buy them has been hard to come by and expensive. And much like the housing shortage overall, the shortage of manufactured housing has put tenants in a precarious position. And those tenants do include people who own their houses, but not the land under their houses.
Great. I think I'm going to just use my prerogative to kind of bring it back to one last question and then we'll kind of close out. But I'm definitely always struck by that slide where it looks at here's all the different legislation that other states have passed. 80 pieces of legislation nationwide. A broad question from your view, how is New Mexico comparing to other states in terms of passing legislation? And then just kind of a follow-on of that is like, why at the state level? Why is this not just, and you referenced it a little bit, but say a little bit more maybe of why not, isn't this just a bunch of ordinances at city level or county level? Why it's the state level?
So we've seen in our research that the amount of housing in an area, in a region, has 4 times the impact on local rents as the amount of housing in that locality. So housing markets are regional. And unless every jurisdiction acts together, the affordability improvements are just smaller than they are if they come from the state, where everyone is moving at the same time. And so we are seeing, we've seen 18 states pass casita laws at this point to allow single-family property owners to add a casita. New Mexico hasn't. We've seen 13 states pass laws to allow apartments automatically, either on commercial land or near transit. New Mexico hasn't. We're seeing third-party reviews. We're seeing pre-approved plans. We're seeing states pass laws to make office to residential conversions a by right use that does not require a variance, doesn't require a rezoning. New Mexico hasn't. We're seeing states cap how much parking can be required, whether that's Florida or Maine or Texas or Washington or Montana and Colorado. New Mexico hasn't. So New Mexico is the only state in the Southwest that has not passed any major laws to allow more homes at this point. Arizona's done it. Texas has done it. Colorado's done it. Utah's done it. Nevada's done it. California's done it, right? I mean, so New Mexico has become an outlier for the region. And the fact that rents have risen so much and prices have risen so much and homelessness has risen so much is predictable from how little housing is being produced in New Mexico. And the state has not passed any laws yet to address that, even though a majority of states in the US have.
Great. And that's, I think, a really good place for us to end this, and a really good kind of, for us, as we're looking at it from the Thornburg Foundation, that's kind of a bit of a list of a to-do list, if you will, not a call to action. We don't do those. But Alex, I want to thank you so much. This has been a really great conversation. Really appreciate all the research that you all have done. Want to say thank you all to our guests. This has been a really great conversation, great questions. For us on the Thornburg side, this is, we look at this as kind of we've learned a lot out of this research, and we're hoping that we can, along with our colleagues, figure out how can we kind of advance these different recommendations in, through the structures that we have and the partnerships that we have. And so last thing I might just note is, is that I know that the Pew Charitable Trust is doing a housing convening on October 21st. It's on adaptive reuse and co-living. And so if you're interested in more information about this and looking at it from a, even more national perspective, that's October 21st. I don't think that they have the webinar link out yet, but when we do get it, we will gladly share with everybody who joined us today. And with that, I think I'll So again, thank you, Alex. Thank you to everybody. And we'll hopefully see you all at the next webinar. So
Sounds good. Thanks to Thornburg for hosting today. Appreciate it.